Hey, welcome back to another tutorial. This one is going to be on claims, evidence, and reasoning. We sometimes abbreviate that CER.
So if you want to implement some claims, evidence, and reasoning into an upcoming lesson, the first thing you need to do is think about the content you want your students to learn and come up with a good question that guides them through the lesson.
Next up is the claim. The claim usually comes after the students have looked at some type of data or resource. It should be the answer to the question. It should be accurate and specific, and it should be very short, usually a sentence long.
Once your students have written their claim, which answers the question, then they have to provide evidence that supports the claim they're trying to make. You have to make sure that the data the students are supplying as evidence actually supports the claim that they're making. The resources they used must be valid. Either you can provide them with resources, or if, depending on the class, you could let them find the resources themselves. It's also important that they know how to use multiple pieces of evidence in supporting the claim.
Once we have our evidence, we're going to move on to the next step, which is reasoning. And reasoning answers the question, how does the evidence support the claim? It is the explanation that connects the claim to the evidence, so it's what ties everything together. It tells you why the data you selected counts as evidence. And this is important because it shows validity of your evidence. And it also will help them decipher whether what they collected is actually evidence or not. Another thing is it shows a detailed understanding of the content. If they can make the connection between the claim and the evidence, then they have good reason behind it, and it's going to help you understand what they know. Lastly, it should be a paragraph. Some teachers like to use bullet points there. That's fine, but the main point is it should have some substance to it.
And now, to give you a better sense of how this whole thing would work, here's an example. So imagine you're an English teacher and your class just finished reading Romeo and Juliet. You can now start by giving your class a question that you want them to think about and answer. For example, you could ask, who should be held responsible for Romeo and Juliet's death?
Once the question has been announced, we should start working towards the next step, which is the claim. So they read the book, they have been given a question, and now they're going to make a claim. And a claim can be true in multiple situations. In the book, you could really argue that there's a lot of people that could be held responsible for the death of Romeo and Juliet. In this case, we're going to go with the Capulets and the Montagues were responsible for the death of Romeo and Juliet.
Once your students have come up with the claim they want to make, they then, of course, have to give evidence that supports the claim. This evidence could be found in a variety of places, most obviously from the book itself. They have to pull several pieces of supporting data, maybe even quoting the text in the process. For a more advanced class, you could have them pull evidence from multiple sources, maybe a movie or theatrical version of Romeo and Juliet, maybe even a secondary source summarizing the book. So it's possible your students could say things such as, the two families had strong feelings of dislike for each other, the families would never allow Romeo and Juliet to be together, or Juliet's father is pushing Juliet to marry Paris.
After collecting the evidence, we now have to show how the evidence supports the claim in our reasoning. Students should explain this, and here is an example of a good reasoning. The Capulet and Montague families are indirectly to blame for the death of Romeo and Juliet because of the feud going on between families and the foreseen disapproval of the relationship. Romeo and Juliet felt a sense of hopelessness. In the book, Juliet speaks about the conflict between families and how problematic the relationship is with this quote, "My only love sprung from my only hate." When looking at the evidence, the direct blame would be on Romeo and Juliet because they chose to take their own lives. So in this reasoning, they're identifying that there are indirect blame with the Montague and Capulet families, but they go on and they have to tell the whole story here. So They go on and say that the direct blame was actually on Romeo and Juliet because they indeed planned this out and took their own lives.
Next, we have just a graphic organizer that could be used to sort of help your students organize their ideas before they complete a CER. At the top, you'll see a line for the question that you provide. Beneath that is where they can list the different sources of evidence they've gathered from their observations or from whatever different sources you're having them access. This one's geared towards science, so you could delete these boxes or just ignore them. But if you are working in science, they should link the different pieces of evidence to concepts or principles from class. Here's where their claim goes, and then the explanation is what we've been calling reasoning, which of course links the evidence to the claim.
Just a recap of CER. Let's take a look at this little picture borrowed from Edutopia. The claim is, what do you know? Plus the evidence, how do you know that? Plus the reasoning, why does your evidence support your claim, equals the explanation. I just thought this was a pretty good wrap-up of what we went over. Once your students get this, it will help them develop better conclusions in science or better explanations in your other subject areas. If you guys have any questions on how to get one of these rolling, contact the tech team, Nick, Dana, or myself, and we'd be happy to sit down with you and walk you through one of these.